Hi, my name is Connie Lefebvre, and this is my presentation of my research for the purposes of the class Writing and Technology 6345. Today I'd like to present the topic of cognitive bias and how it plays a role in the human-artificial intelligence interface in my learning. And my presentation is called Choose Your Avatar, the Cognitive Bias and Human-Artificial Intelligence Interface in Learning. Today we'll be discussing the importance of identifying cognitive bias and how those biases can be mitigated. Today we're going to look ahead at the brief history of cognitive bias and writing and technology. We're going to define cognitive bias and the word avatar, as well as look at the types of biases and effects and how they can be mitigated. And lastly, how this is integrated into the human-computer interface. Some of the research questions that I used for my research included what cognitive biases exist in both writing and technology, how they can be mitigated, and how one can identify cognitive biases in writing and technology. How will technology answer the stereotypical cultural and social and academic biases that have been constructed? So let's first begin by defining the word cognitive bias and avatar, as they will be used to reference the users in the human-computer interface. When we think of avatar, we immediately connect to a game module or a character, which we now use as a modern definition. However, the word avatar, for the purpose of this research, is the role that the user plays in the scenario of learning that allows them to participate using their own experiences through writing-based technology. An avatar can be used to show how whole generations of users are thrust into various fields that contain these computer interfaces. Avatar is used to define the digital user's online identity, but it was originally derived from an ancient Indian religion of Hinduism, meaning descent. And for the purposes of this presentation, it is the user that is represented in the human-computer interface. Cognitive bias is essentially human errors. They are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality or objective judgment, which can distort decision-making. PUM 2. Cognitive biases are errors in judgment that have formed as a result of biased data collection or misrepresented samples of data in artificial intelligence-based systems. Let's look at a brief history of cognitive bias and how it was discovered. Since the beginning of time, and as mankind evolved, we learned to speak and write and eventually began our own oral traditions of passing down our stories and our ancestry. And as we evolved, we did this need to find out better ways to pass that information down and do it faster. We needed a way to communicate faster and more efficiently, which as a result has led to the discovery of electricity and later the internet and ways of storing information. The discussion of heuristics began in 1970s, and the study led to open discussions about mental shortcuts and decision making, which eventually led to human-computer interfaces. A heuristic algorithm is a problem-solving technique designed to find a good enough solution quickly when classic methods are too slow or fail to find an exact solution. Heuristics trade optimally completeness, accuracy, or precision for speed, making them useful in situations where finding the best solution is not feasible. Heuristics become key factors of influence that affect cognitive bias. As a result, the research has been conducted. The scholars have discovered that they are key in human thinking and decision making and how people see and understand and receive data. So Fuji apple versus regular apple. This is based on not being able to collect the data that is diverse in order to make accurate scenarios for the user. Researchers discovered that heuristics were key factors which influenced decision making by using emotions, social influences, and cultural norms. See, heuristics were employed in the computer interface in order to make the experience more enjoyable, such as using an avatar where you could pick your personal preferences. Color and animation and audio were also added to enhance the computer user experience. Now, these positive effects help to make learning more effective and enjoyable. However, researchers in the field have discovered that the negative factors called cognitive biases deployed in large language models, we call those LLMs, like ChatGPT and AI platforms, may negatively affect learning outcomes. Now I want to discuss the types of biases that we encounter in environments that surround humans to computer interface and affect the way we get bias into our writing and technology. The first kinds of stereotypical responses or behaviors of cognitive bias can be towards race, gender, and politics. For instance, the Alexa example, we can use that in different ways where they have shown to have political bias in certain instances during political campaigns. The race, gender stereotypes are often cast into the computer's user interface when data samples and collection methods are corrupted. They do this when they collect the data. They inadvertently do not receive data from a diversified data collection method. In other words, if there's a group of a certain color being asked questions, instead of many groups, when you're only going to get a bias towards that ethnicity or group, by allowing data collection from a very diversified population, you're going to get clear, more efficient, and unbiased results. Another type of stereotypical response and behavior is towards the disabled. Many times the disabled are viewed as a marginalized group and are cast outside of the cultural norms because of the way that they address the way they live their lives. And because the disabled are often viewed as a marginalized group, they're often overlooked. And they're looked at as different and not part of the cultural norm. This can cause biased information to be collected about these groups due to the inability to see the group as part of the norm. We can find these biases in technology, as well as in some cases researchers have forced cochlear implants on the disabled. Many disabled have already formed their own identities and do not see the need, what they consider to be outside influences. And there are also errors in medical screening, which can cause or lead to treatments or diagnoses that are inaccurate. Although we have very competent medical professionals, they rely heavily on scans and data to confirm their diagnosis and treatment. If a medical professional were to get the wrong information, then they could inadvertently cause more damage or more harm on that patient. And there are biases in academic writing and on online databases due to word frequency, such as ChatGPT and online academic databases. For instance, the academic databases that we're using right now for our graduate degrees contain many abstracts that summarize the articles that we read, but do not go into detail. Many of those searches that graduate students use often rely on the word frequency, which can be found in the abstracts, versus the online article that they're summarizing. Therefore, it is essential to make sure that research is conducted not using the same word frequency as other searches to find the best information. Other biases when we collect data for forensics affect the way that the criminal justice system uses biases in certain cases. For instance, if the police process the data wrong, committing an error in human judgment, then this affects the ability to prosecute a crime. We also see these cognitive biases in selecting juries, as well as prosecuting cases. We see bias in social media platforms all the time. And TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and other social media platforms present information that may be in fact inaccurate. So we also find bias in journalism, and these reports, as journalists, are using less and less sources to report information that may actually be inaccurate or not credible. We later find out that in many cases that the journalism presented inaccurate information in order to gain a certain viewpoint towards their personal political views. As well as environmental science, we also see rhetorical bias when advertisers use the digital number to convince the buyer that the Fuji apple that is shiny and clean and new is the one that they should buy, as they set it next to a regular apple with no fancy name at all. In an article by Minkorn Pym entitled Cognitive Bias in AI Development, Understanding the Psychological and Societal Influences that Shape AI Model Design and Outcomes, he explains 4 types of biases that are found in everyday computer-to-human interface exchanges. For instance, the confirmation bias. It tends to seek out or interpret information that confirms one's existing beliefs rather than seeing the data that's right in front of them. And the human often overlooks information that contradicts them because they favor the information that exists in relationship to their beliefs. So anchoring bias tends to rely heavily on the first piece of evidence it sees rather than viewing any other data. And the human psyche often believes one type of data over others and tends to rely on their own beliefs the first thing they see that dictate what they should believe. In availability heuristics, the human tends to judge the probability of a situation based on examples that can come to mind rather than statistical evidence that they have found. They often refuse to believe the statistical evidence over their own mind. And the last type of groupthink, the tendency for groups to make decisions and prioritize a consensus and harmony over an evaluation of alternative data. And this often results in biased decisions. So now that we know about the types of biases, let's take a look at the way we collect the data. In an article by Fernando Salvetti, he states that the human-computer interactions and biases are revealed in the collection of data, the information available, and the way that the artificial intelligence is trained to accept that data using large language models. In an article by Natapat Bunkrapong entitled How Do HCI Researchers Study Cognitive Biases? The scoping review, they go into in-depth detail of how they collect the data and how they use it to compare it to human real-world scenarios based on what they believe or prefer, based on heuristics. Bunkrapong believes that interacting with computers, humans form mental model internal representations of the external reality based on what they believe or prefer or what they're familiar with. This is what triggers the availability of heuristics and other types of biases in the research. In an article entitled Forewarning Artificial Intelligence About Cognitive Biases by Wang, it states that some scholars believe that cognitive biases are causing large language models to produce faulty medical recommendations. This is where the seriousness of identifying the cognitive bias plays the role. We all see fake posts such as AI images or news reports that have become prominent because of the media-based apps that spread false and deceiving information. And in many cases, it's hard to choose between the real information and the AI-generated information because of the appearance of credible sources. Lastly, data collection without proper diverse populations and monitoring can lead to misuse of the information. So although we monitor what we find, we still frequently get the information wrong. And it can be used in a biased way, especially when programming large language models used by computers like ChatGPT. Now that we know there's a problem in the computer user interface, how can these biases be mitigated? First, the use of an avatar in multiple disciplinary fields has strengthened learning and critical thinking due to the user making their own preferences. These cognitive abilities enable individuals to navigate complex situations. And they make well-informed decisions and the choices and apply logical reasoning while avoiding misconception and bias. It makes sense if the user is involved in the process of learning that they can lead themselves based on their own choices rather than questioning our prompts from program instructional models. Models can also indicate that if they're taught to slow down and reflect on the prompts, less bias occurs. Bunkrapong, in his article, uses the System 1 and System 2 instructional model to explain this in his article. He states that in System 1, users often allow information to be dictated to them and then make a choice that could be negatively influenced. In System 2, the user hears the information, but is allowed to stop, pause, and reflect on the information before making a selection. This is one simple act that can change the way that users use information. Researchers can monitor systems and actually use the system to limit the effects of the bias on the user, as well as they must become involved in the system that they're creating. When they do this, they can also carefully regulate rules for online data, as well as confirm information received and reports. Sometimes the data is misrepresented due to the lack of diverse data and the misinterpretation. And lastly, the environment itself has a big impact on the user. Intervention in that environment by stepping into the situation where the users can help them make the right decision helps mitigate that bias. Finally, it is important to remember to find the balance between human-computer interface and free thinking so that we can identify the biases when we see them and then mitigate the responses of those biases. It is important to remember that we are humans and we have errors, which cause most of the biases in the first place. Those may be something that can never change. We can't completely and perfectly process and collect data and design algorithms that resemble human and interaction without bias. However, we can limit it. We also have not been able to eliminate our own cognitive biases. So inevitably, I believe we will always have some effects on the outcome of the computer to human interface. This concludes my presentation, but I wanted to thank you for listening today about cognitive biases and how we can mitigate the responses. And to remember that in the scope of human-computer interface, if you choose your own avatar, you'll have less bias reporting and have a better learning experience all the way around. If you have any questions, please email me at this address. And thank you for allowing me to speak to you on this subject.